People like you don't belong in rooms like this." The words didn't echo. They landed, heavy and deliberate, cutting through the low murmur of the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to pause as if the air itself was waiting to see what would happen next, the fluorescent lights above humming faintly, casting a cold, almost clinical glow across polished wooden benches and stiff-backed chairs filled with spectators who had long since learned to look without seeing and hear without reacting. Because in places like this, moments like these weren't rare. They were routine, just another quiet display of power disguised as procedure, and at the center of it stood Officer Ryan Cole, shoulders squared, badge catching the light, as he tilted his head slightly with a smirk that suggested he had done this before, said these things before, gotten away with it before. His voice laced with a casual certainty that came not from truth, but from years of never being questioned, never being corrected, never being told he was wrong. And across the room, seated alone in the second row, was Naomi Hayes, her posture straight but unassuming, hands resting calmly on a worn black briefcase placed neatly in her lap, her expression unreadable, almost distant, as though the words directed at her had to travel a much longer distance to reach her than they did for everyone else in the room. And yet, if you looked closely, really closely, you might notice the stillness wasn't emptiness, it was control, the kind that doesn't come from silence alone, but from knowing something others don't, from holding a truth that hasn't yet been spoken. And around her, the room shifted subtly, not in sound but in feeling, a faint tightening in the posture of a young prosecutor flipping through files a little too quickly, a clerk pausing mid-motion as if reconsidering something unspoken. Even the judge, seated high above with practiced neutrality, allowed his gaze to linger a fraction longer than usual before, returning to the paperwork in front of him. But none of that registered with Ryan Cole, not in the way it should have, because confidence, unchecked and unchallenged, has a way of narrowing a man's vision until all he sees is what he expects to see. And what he saw now was a woman he had already decided didn't belong, didn't matter, didn't have the standing to push back. So he took a step forward, just enough to make the distance between them feel intentional, controlled, his voice lowering slightly, but carrying even further as the room leaned into the tension without realizing it. "You understand this is a federal courtroom, right?" he said, the edge in his tone sharpened by a quiet laugh that never quite reached his eyes, and somewhere in the back, a faint chuckle followed. Hesitant, unsure, but present, because people often laugh not out of agreement, but out of discomfort, out of a need to align themselves with whoever appears to hold the power. And still, Naomi didn't respond, not with words, not with movement, not even with the kind of reaction most people would expect when placed under a spotlight like this. Instead, she simply looked at him, steady and unwavering, her gaze neither confrontational nor submissive, just present. And that presence, quiet as it was, began to stretch across the room in ways no one could quite explain, like a tension building beneath the surface of calm water, invisible until the moment it breaks. And for the first time, though he wouldn't admit it, not yet, there was something in Ryan Cole's chest that didn't feel like certainty anymore. Something small, something unfamiliar, something that suggested that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the kind of moment he thought it was. But by then, the room was already shifting, already leaning towards something no one there was prepared to witness. And the silence, the kind that comes before everything changes, had begun to settle in. The silence did not break all at once. It stretched, thin and fragile, like glass under pressure. And somewhere near the front row, a pin slipped from someone's hand and hit the floor with a sharp, isolated click that sounded louder than it should have, drawing a few brief glances before eyes quickly returned to the center of the room. Because something was happening here, something subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that people feel before they understand it. And Naomi Hayes remained exactly where she was, unmoved, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of that worn black briefcase, as if it carried no weight at all, even though the way her thumb traced the corner suggested familiarity, ownership, control, while Officer Ryan Cole let out a short breath through his nose, the kind that was almost a laugh, but not quite, as if he were reassuring himself that nothing had changed, that this was still his moment, still his room, still his authority to command. and he turned slightly toward the judge with a half-shrug that carried more attitude than respect. "Your Honor, do we really need to entertain this?" he said, gesturing loosely in Naomi's direction without even looking at her now, as though she had already been dismissed in his mind, filed away as irrelevant. And for a second, just a second, the judge did not respond, his fingers resting against the wooden surface in front of him, his expression unreadable but no longer entirely detached. And that hesitation, brief as it was, did not go unnoticed, not by the young prosecutor seated at the table to the left who suddenly straightened his posture, not by the court reporter whose typing slowed just enough to create a barely perceptible gap in the steady rhythm of keystrokes, and certainly not by Naomi, whose eyes remained fixed forward, calm and steady, as if she had been expecting this exact sequence of moments to unfold in this exact order. And then, slowly, she shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded attention, but just enough to stand, the soft scrape of her chair against the polished floor cutting cleanly through the tension like a quiet signal that something had just crossed an invisible line. And that was when Ryan finally looked at her again, really looked this time, not with dismissal but with a flicker of something else, something closer to confusion than confidence, because her expression had not changed, but her presence had. It had sharpened, focused, as though the room itself had adjusted to accommodate her rather than the other way around. And she reached down, lifting the briefcase with deliberate ease, the clasps clicking open with a precise, controlled sound that echoed farther than it should have in the stillness. And inside, neatly organized, were documents, folders, tabs marked with clean lettering, the kind of structure that spoke of preparation, of time, of intention, and not the rushed, chaotic kind that came from scrambling to defend oneself, but the quiet, methodical kind that came from building something piece by piece long before anyone realized it was there. And across the room, the young prosecutor's eyes widened just slightly as recognition flickered across his face, his lips parting as if he were about to speak before thinking better of it, while Ryan's jaw tightened, the shift in his stance almost imperceptible but real, his weight redistributing as though the ground beneath him had changed without warning. And still, no one spoke, because whatever this was, it had moved beyond interruption, beyond casual dismissal, into something else entirely, something that demanded attention whether it was given, willingly or not. And when Naomi finally took a single step forward, the sound of her heel against the floor was soft, controlled, but it carried in a way that made it impossible to ignore. And in that moment, the room understood something before it was ever said out loud, that this was not a reaction, not a defense, not an attempt to explain or justify. This was something planned, something intentional, something that had been waiting for exactly this moment to begin. The moment her foot settled against the floor, something invisible shifted completely, not in a way that could be measured or explained, but in the way every person in that courtroom seemed to hold their breath without realizing it, as if an unspoken signal had passed through the room and reset the balance of something deeper than authority. And Naomi Hayes did not rush, did not raise her voice, did not demand attention, because she did not need to. Her presence had already begun to pull every eye toward her with a quiet gravity that made resistance feel unnatural. And as she moved forward, one step at a time, the faint sound of her heel marked each second with precision, steady and controlled, until she reached the center aisle, where she stopped, not directly facing Ryan Cole, not yet, but angled just enough to acknowledge him without granting him control of the moment. And for the first time since he had spoken, his expression faltered, just slightly, his confidence no longer flowing as easily as before, replaced by a tightening around his eyes, a hesitation that came from sensing something he could not yet define. And he cleared his throat, shifting his stance as if preparing to reassert himself. "If you have something to say, you can say it from there," he said, his voice firmer now, louder, attempting to reclaim the room, but it did not land the same way it had before, because the room itself had changed. The attention no longer belonged to him. It had moved, slowly but completely, toward her, and Naomi did not respond to the instruction. She did not argue, did not challenge. She simply reached into her briefcase and withdrew a single folder, smooth, unwrinkled, marked with a clean federal seal that caught the light just enough to draw the eye. And that was when the shift became visible, not just felt, because across the courtroom, the young prosecutor who had been quietly observing leaned forward abruptly, his earlier uncertainty now replaced with recognition, his gaze locking onto the document, as if he had seen something he was not expecting to see here. Not today, not like this. And even the judge, who had maintained a careful distance from the tension unfolding below, straightened in his seat, his fingers no longer resting idly but gripping the edge of the bench with subtle intent, his attention now fully engaged. And Naomi lifted her eyes, not to Ryan, but to the judge, her voice calm, steady, and measured in a way that did not ask for permission but carried its own authority. "Your Honor," she said, and the room seemed to absorb the words rather than react to them, because there was no strain, no hesitation, just certainty. "I believe it is time to clarify my role in these proceedings," and the phrasing itself created a ripple, small but immediate, because roles in this room were assigned, declared, known in advance, not revealed in the middle of tension, not introduced after a confrontation. And yet here it was, unfolding in real time, and Ryan Cole felt it now, unmistakably, the ground beneath his certainty shifting in a way that no training had prepared him for, his jaw tightening as his eyes flicked from her to the judge and back again, searching for confirmation, for dismissal, for anything that would restore the familiar structure he relied on. But it did not come. Instead, there was silence, deeper now, heavier, and Naomi opened the folder with deliberate care, revealing neatly arranged documents, each page aligned with precision, the top sheet bearing a header that the prosecutor had already recognized, the kind that did not belong to defense arguments or witness statements, but to something far more controlled, far more deliberate. And as she turned that first page, the soft movement of paper sounded louder than any raised voice, because in that moment, everyone understood, even before the words were spoken, that this was not an interruption, not a defense, not a reaction to humiliation. This was the beginning of something that had been set in motion long before anyone in that room realized they were part of it. The sound of the page turning did not rush. It unfolded slowly, deliberately, as if even the paper understood the weight of what it carried. And Naomi Hayes held it there for just a second longer than necessary, not for effect, not for drama, but because timing, like everything else about this moment, had already been decided long before she stepped into that room. And when she finally spoke again, her voice did not rise, did not sharpen. It remained calm, measured, almost quiet, yet it reached every corner of the courtroom with a clarity that made interruption feel impossible. "For the record," she said, her eyes still on the judge, not shifting, not wavering. "My name is Naomi Hayes, and I am appearing here in my official capacity as Chief Federal Prosecutor assigned to the Oversight Division of this case." And the words did not explode. They settled, heavy and undeniable, sinking into the room in a way that changed everything without needing to announce it. Because authority, real authority, does not demand recognition. It reveals itself, and the reaction came not as noise but as stillness, a deeper, more absolute silence than before, the kind that follows when understanding arrives all at once. And across the courtroom, the young prosecutor's posture snapped fully upright, his earlier uncertainty replaced by a sharp, unmistakable awareness, while the court reporter's hands paused completely above the keys, as if even the act of recording needed a second to catch up with what had just been said. And on the bench, the judge leaned forward slightly, not out of confusion, but out of recognition, his expression shifting from detached observation to formal acknowledgement, because the title she had just stated was not one that could be questioned, not one that could be ignored. And in that same moment, Ryan Cole felt it, fully this time, the collapse of the assumption he had been standing on, his expression tightening as the certainty drained from his stance, replaced by something far less stable, something that moved quickly from confusion to realization. And he opened his mouth as if to speak, to correct, to push back, but no words came, because there was nothing left to assert that had not already been undone. And Naomi finally turned her gaze toward him, not sharply, not with anger, but with a steady focus that carried no hostility, only truth, the kind that does not need to raise its voice to be heard. And for a brief moment, the distance between them felt different, not physical, but structural. as though the roles that had been assumed at the start of this exchange had quietly reversed without anyone needing to declare it. And she took one more step forward, closing that distance just enough to place the folder on the central table with a soft, controlled motion, the documents inside now visible to those closest, each page marked, organized, intentional. And when she spoke again, it was not to defend herself, not to respond to what had been said to her, but to move the room forward. These documents outline a series of procedural concerns and internal inconsistencies connected to the conduct under review today, she said, her tone unchanged, steady, precise, and the phrasing alone made it clear that this was not personal, not reactive. It was structural, systemic, something larger than a single exchange of words. And that realization spread through the room like a quiet wave, shifting attention, shifting alignment, until even those who had moments ago been passive observers found themselves leaning in, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity, because whatever this was, it was no longer something happening to one person. It was something that had begun to involve everyone present, and Ryan stood there, no longer the center of the room, no longer the voice that shaped it, but a part of something unfolding beyond his control. And for the first time since he had spoken, he did not know what would happen next. No one reached for the documents at first, not because they were uninterested, but because something about the way they were presented made it clear that this was not an invitation. It was a transition, a shift from assumption to verification, and the hesitation itself spoke louder than any immediate reaction could have, as if every person in that courtroom understood, on some level, that once those pages were read, there would be no returning to what the room had been just minutes ago. And Naomi Hayes stood still beside the table, not urging, not explaining further, her composure unchanged, her presence steady in a way that did not press forward but did not yield either. And it was the judge who moved first, his hand extending toward the folder with measured intent, the slight movement of his robe brushing against the bench, the only sound breaking the stillness before his fingers closed around the top page, lifting it just enough to read the heading. And whatever he saw there did not cause a visible reaction, not immediately, but his posture shifted, subtle yet unmistakable, his back straightening, his focus sharpening, and that alone was enough to send a ripple through the room, because authority recognizes authority long before it announces it. And across the aisle, the young prosecutor leaned closer, unable to remain detached any longer, his eyes scanning the visible portions of the document with growing intensity, his earlier uncertainty now replaced with something closer to urgency, while the court reporter resumed typing, but slower now, more deliberate, as if each word carried more weight than before. And Ryan Cole stood where he had been, but nothing about his stance felt the same. The confidence that once defined his posture now replaced by a rigidity that came not from control, but from restraint, as if he were holding himself in place, trying to process something that refused to fit into the framework he understood. And his gaze flicked toward the judge, searching, measuring, waiting for some signal that would clarify where this was going. But none came, because the moment had already moved beyond signals, beyond cues, into something far more definitive. And Naomi finally spoke again, not to interrupt, but to guide the direction of what was already unfolding. The material you are reviewing reflects a pattern, not an isolated incident, she said, her voice even, controlled, carrying no accusation, yet leaving no room for dismissal. And the phrasing itself shifted the scale of the situation, because patterns imply repetition, repetition implies awareness, and awareness implies responsibility. And those implications settled into the room with a quiet force that did not need to be emphasized to be understood. And the judge turned another page, then another, his movement steady but increasingly focused, while the young prosecutor's expression tightened, the realization of what these documents represented beginning to take shape in real time. And Ryan felt it now, fully and unmistakably, not just the loss of control over the conversation, but the emergence of something larger than himself, something that no longer centered on his words or his authority, but on the structure surrounding them, the system that now seemed to be looking back at him instead of supporting him. And for the first time since this began, he did not speak, did not attempt to redirect, because instinct, the kind that surfaces when certainty disappears, told him that anything he said now would not restore what had already shifted. and Naomi remained exactly where she was, composed, precise, not watching the room react, not measuring the impact of her words, because she already knew what those documents contained. She already knew what they would reveal, and she had not brought them here to surprise the room, but to confirm what had been building beneath the surface all along. And as another page turned, the quiet sound seemed to echo further than before, not because it was louder, but because now everyone was listening. The air in the courtroom no longer felt neutral. It carried weight now, the kind that settles into the chest and makes even the smallest movements feel deliberate. And as the judge continued to scan the pages in front of him, his expression grew more focused, not dramatic, not outwardly reactive, but precise in a way that signaled recognition rather than surprise, as though what he was seeing confirmed something he had not yet been given the authority to act on until this exact moment. And when he finally looked up, his gaze did not return to the bench. It moved directly toward Naomi Hayes, holding there for a brief second that did not need explanation, because acknowledgement at that level did not require words. And then, slowly, he nodded, not to her as a person, but to the position she carried, to the authority now present in the room. And that single motion shifted everything further, because it removed the last layer of uncertainty that anyone might have held onto. And across the courtroom, the young prosecutor exhaled quietly, as if a tension he had been holding without realizing it had finally released, his attention now fully aligned with Naomi, no longer questioning, no longer observing from a distance, but engaged, ready, while the court reporter's hands moved again with renewed consistency, capturing each second as if the record itself understood the significance of what was unfolding. And Ryan Cole felt it more clearly than anyone. The moment where control does not slip gradually but disappears entirely, leaving behind a stillness that is not calm but exposure. And he shifted his weight again, his shoulders tightening, his eyes no longer scanning the room for validation but narrowing slightly as he tried to read what came next, what direction this would take, what part he would now play in a situation he no longer defined. And Naomi did not rush to fill the silence. She allowed it to settle, to expand, to make space for what needed to be understood without being forced. And when she finally spoke, her voice remained unchanged, steady, grounded, carrying the same measured tone that had guided every word so far. "This review was not initiated today," she said, her gaze moving briefly across the room before returning to the judge. "And it was not triggered by a single moment or a single interaction." And the phrasing again shifted the scale, widening the frame of what this was, pulling it away from the present tension and anchoring it in something longer, something deeper, something that had been unfolding over time. And as those words settled, the young prosecutor's eyes flicked back to the documents, his fingers hovering just above the table as if resisting the urge to reach for them, while the judge turned another page, slower now, more deliberate, each movement signaling that what he was reading was no longer routine. And Ryan's jaw tightened further, the realization beginning to take a more defined shape, because patterns, procedures, oversight, these were not abstract terms, they were structures, and structures had consequences. And for the first time since he had spoken earlier, there was no response forming in his mind, no immediate reaction ready to surface, only a growing awareness that whatever this process was, it had already moved beyond him, beyond anything he could redirect or dismiss. And Naomi took a small breath, not out of hesitation, but as a natural pause, a transition point. And when she continued, her words were just as calm, just as precise. "What you are seeing is the result of a coordinated review conducted over several months, involving multiple departments and independent verification." And that sentence alone reshaped the room entirely, because it removed any remaining illusion that this was spontaneous, that this was reactive, that this was personal, instead placing it firmly within the realm of planning, structure, and intent. And the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was settled, defined, the kind of silence that comes when everyone present understands that they are no longer witnessing an incident, but the outcome of something that has already been set in motion, something that will continue forward regardless of what anyone in that room says next. The words did not fade when she finished speaking. They lingered, suspended in the air like a quiet verdict that had not yet been spoken aloud but had already been understood, and for a moment, no one moved, not because they were unsure of what to do, but because every next step now carried weight, consequence, direction, and the courtroom, once filled with routine motion and predictable exchanges, had become something else entirely, something slower, more deliberate, as if time itself had adjusted to match the gravity of what was unfolding, and the judge closed the folder halfway, not to dismiss it, but to mark a transition, his eyes lifting once again to Naomi Hayes, holding there longer this time, not just in acknowledgement, but in alignment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a different tone than before, not louder, not harsher, but grounded, definitive. "Ms. Hayes," he said, the title deliberate, precise. "The court recognizes your authority in this matter," and that sentence did not echo. It settled, final and clear, removing any remaining ambiguity from the room. And across the aisle, the young prosecutor straightened fully, his earlier hesitation gone entirely, replaced with a readiness that mirrored the shift in the bench, his attention now fully synchronized with the direction Naomi had set, while the court reporter continued typing without pause, each keystroke now part of a record that had moved far beyond its original scope. And Ryan Cole stood still, but the stillness was no longer composed. It was contained, the kind that comes when movement no longer feels like an option, his gaze fixed ahead, not defiant, not dismissive, but searching, recalculating, as if trying to understand where he now stood in a structure that had quietly redefined itself around him. And Naomi did not look at him immediately. She allowed the recognition from the bench to settle first, to establish itself fully before she shifted her attention, because this was not about confrontation, it was about clarity, and when she finally turned, her gaze met his with the same steady calm that had carried her through every moment so far, not accusing, not emotional, but unwavering, and she spoke, her voice even, controlled, carrying no trace of the earlier tension. "Officer Cole," she said, and the use of his name, formal and precise, carried more weight now than any raised tone could have. "You are not being addressed here as an individual incident." And the phrasing landed with quiet force, because it removed the possibility of simplification, of reducing what was happening to a single exchange or a single mistake, and she continued without pause. "You are part of a broader review concerning conduct, procedure, and accountability within your department." And as those words settled, the meaning expanded, reaching beyond him, beyond the moment, into something larger, something systemic, and the room absorbed it in silence, the kind that no longer questioned but processed, aligned, understood, and Ryan's expression shifted again, the realization now fully formed, because this was no longer about what he had said earlier, no longer about a moment he could explain or justify. It was about a pattern he could not isolate himself from, and that understanding carried a different weight entirely, one that did not invite argument but demanded acknowledgement. And Naomi took a small step back from the table, not retreating, but repositioning, creating space for what came next, and when she spoke again, her tone remained unchanged, steady, measured. "The findings will be presented in full, and appropriate actions will follow based on verified evidence and established legal standards." And the phrasing left no room for speculation, no room for negotiation, because it was not a statement of possibility, it was a statement of process, already in motion, already defined. And as the silence returned once more, it was no longer uncertain, no longer fragile. It was firm, settled, the kind of silence that marks the moment when a situation stops being questioned and starts being decided. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt structured, like every second now had a place, a direction, a purpose that no one in the room could interrupt even if they wanted to. And Naomi Hayes remained composed, her posture unchanged, her presence no longer something the room reacted to but something it followed. And as she gently closed the folder on the table, the soft sound of it settling into place carried a finality that did not need to be announced, because everything that needed to be introduced had already been placed in front of them. And now it was no longer about revelation, it was about consequence, and the judge drew in a measured breath, his gaze moving briefly across the courtroom before returning to the documents. then to Naomi, and then, finally, to Ryan Cole, and that sequence alone made the shift unmistakable, because attention in that room had become directional, intentional, and when the judge spoke again, his voice carried the same controlled authority, but now it held weight that extended beyond procedure, based on the material presented, and the authority now recognized. This court will proceed with immediate administrative review in accordance with federal oversight guidelines, he said, each word placed carefully, leaving no ambiguity in its meaning. And across the room, the young prosecutor nodded almost instinctively, already reaching for a notepad, his pen moving quickly, efficiently, as if aligning himself with a process that had already begun without him, while the court reporter's typing became steady again, no longer hesitant, no longer searching, but documenting something that was no longer uncertain. And Ryan Cole stood in place, but the space around him had changed, not physically, but perceptibly, the distance between him and everyone else no longer defined by proximity, but by position, by role, by the quiet understanding that he was no longer the one shaping the room, but the one being evaluated within it. And his expression tightened, not in resistance, not in defiance, but in realization, because for the first time, there was no immediate response available to him, no statement that could reframe the situation, no authority he could lean on to redirect what was already unfolding. And Naomi finally shifted her gaze fully toward him, not to confront, not to challenge, but to acknowledge the moment for what it was, her voice calm, unwavering. This process is not designed to single out a moment, she said, her tone steady. Precise, it is designed to ensure that every action within this system reflects the standards it claims to uphold. And the words carried a clarity that made them difficult to ignore, because they did not accuse, they defined, and in doing so, they removed any remaining space for misunderstanding, and the room absorbed that definition in silence, not because it was uncertain, but because it was complete, and Naomi took a small step back, allowing the structure of the courtroom to reassert itself, not as it had been before, but as it now needed to be, aligned with what had been introduced, and the judge gave a single, deliberate nod, signaling continuation, not conclusion, because this was not the end of something, it was the formal beginning of what would follow. And as that realization settled across every person in the room, the atmosphere shifted one final time, from tension to process, from uncertainty to inevitability. And Ryan Cole, standing at the center of that shift, understood it fully now, not in words, not in explanations, but in the quiet, undeniable truth that the moment he thought he controlled had already passed, and what remained was something far more structured, far more precise, and entirely beyond his command. No one spoke when the judge finished, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that needed to be understood had already settled into place, and the courtroom, once filled with subtle tension and unspoken assumptions, now felt different, not lighter, not heavier, but clearer, as if the air itself had been stripped of uncertainty and replaced with something far more precise, far more grounded. And Naomi Hayes stood where she was, no longer at the center of attention but no longer needing to be, because the shift she had brought into the room did not depend on her presence anymore. It had taken root in the structure around her, in the way the judge now reviewed each page with deliberate focus, in the way the prosecutor continued to write with steady purpose, in the way even the smallest movements in the room carried intention instead of habit, and Ryan Cole remained still. But the stillness had changed once more, no longer tense, no longer searching, but reflective, as if the weight of the moment had finally settled into something he could no longer push against or reframe, and for the first time, he lowered his gaze slightly, not in defeat, not in submission, but in recognition, the quiet acknowledgement that the position he believed he held had never been as secure as he thought, and that realization did not come with noise or confrontation. It arrived silently, firmly, leaving no room for denial, and Naomi watched him for just a brief moment, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with a calm understanding that this was never about proving someone wrong. It was about revealing what had already been there, unseen or unchallenged, and she turned her attention back to the bench, her role in this moment complete not because it had ended, but because it had transitioned into something that would continue beyond this room, beyond this day, beyond any single exchange of words, and the judge gave a final nod, not to signal closure, but to confirm direction. A quiet affirmation that the process would move forward exactly as it was meant to, guided not by assumption or authority alone, but by structure, by verification, by the principles that the system was built to uphold. And as the court clerk began to organize the next steps with measured efficiency, the rhythm of the room returned. But it was not the same rhythm as before. It was steadier, more deliberate, aligned with something that had been corrected rather than simply resumed. And Ryan stood within that rhythm now, no longer shaping it, but part of it, subject to it. And as he finally lifted his eyes, again, the room he saw was not the one he had walked into earlier. It was one that had quietly redefined itself in his absence of understanding. And Naomi Hayes, already stepping back into that structure, carried no need to speak further, because the truth did not need repetition. It had already done its work. And as the proceedings continued, one thought lingered in the space between every movement, every word, every decision, steady and undeniable. That power does not belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the one who stands on truth when everything else begins to shift.